Hey guys, welcome back or welcome for the very first time to a space made just for you, right before you drift into sleep. Tonight's story is a hauntingly gentle tale titled The Riverborn, a quiet, emotional journey set in a forgotten medieval village where women accused of witchcraft, heresy, or simply being different were judged not by truth, but by water. But one girl, Ellen, survives the river, and what she brings back will change everything. If you haven't already, I'd be so grateful if you took a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps this small corner of calm reach more people who need stories to fall asleep to. I hope that as you listen tonight, you'll feel the hush of the village, the flicker of candlelight, the slow current of memory, and by the end, find yourself gently slipping into a deep, peaceful sleep. Now, get comfortable, take a deep breath, let the darkness settle around you, and let us begin the story of the Riverborn. In the year when the willows bore no fruit and the skies hung heavy with silence, there stood a village by the banks of a narrow river. Its name was long forgotten, whispered only in crumbling parchments and the brittle memories of old monks. But once it had been a place where windmills turned gently, where children chased geese through fields of clover, and where bells rang in the cold mornings to summon souls to worship. The villagers feared little but the river. They called it Maya water, a name that clung to the tongue like damp cloth. No one drank from it, though its surface shimmered with perfect stillness. No one fished from it, though the reeds swayed as if something stirred below. But most of all, no one swam in it. The river was for one thing and one thing only: judgment. Beneath the fog that often blanketed the hills and drifted low across the water, the villagers spoke in hushed tones of the trial by water, a test not of strength nor wisdom, but of the soul. Women accused of unfaithfulness, of whispering charms in the dark, of gathering herbs not blessed by the priest, these were the ones brought to the river's edge. It was said that water, being a pure and holy element, would reject evil. If the woman floated, she was guilty lifted by demons to escape the water's truth. If she sank, she was innocent, claimed by the river's cold embrace, but often too late to breathe again. At the heart of the village lived a girl named Ellen, 17 winters old. She had hair like the wheat fields at dusk and eyes that held a quiet sadness, as if they remembered something the rest of her did not. Her mother, Lysa, had died when Ellen was small-taken by fever. Her father, Bram, was the village cooper, a quiet man who carved barrels by candlelight and seldom spoke unless spoken to. Ellen worked as a weaver. Her hands, though young, moved with practiced grace over the loom, and her cloth was sought even by traders who passed only briefly through. She sang to herself while she worked old songs her mother used to hum before the fire. Songs about the moon, the moss, and a river that never slept. She had one friend, Alda, older by 3 years, bold and sharp-tongued. Alda's laugh was loud enough to wake the hens, and her skirts always bore a trace of flour or soot from the bakery her family ran. They would sit by the riverbank sometimes, just out of sight of the village, tossing pebbles into the glassy water. Ellen, Alda once said, "Do you think the river knows what it does?" Ellen had looked at the slow-moving water, its surface broken only by the whisper of wind. "I don't think the river chooses. People do." Alda frowned. "But if the water can judge, if it can tell good from evil, why does it let the good ones drown?" Ellen had no answer. One morning, the bell tolled. Once, then twice. Not for a death, not for a birth, but for a summons. A woman had been accused. Her name was Mara, a widow of 34, with green eyes and hair black as raven's wings. She had been seen speaking to a traveler in Outlander with golden earrings and a laughing voice. Some said she had touched his arm. Others claimed she had smiled too long. That was enough. At dawn, the villagers gathered by the river. Mara stood barefoot in a white shift, her hands bound at the wrists. Her lips were tight with fear, but she held her head high. The priest, Father Thorn, read the rites. His voice was cold and clear, like the chime of iron against stone. "She is to be tested," he said, raising a hand toward the sky. "If she floats, her sin is known. If she sinks, her soul is clean, and God shall take her home." Ellen stood among the crowd, her hands cold even beneath her shawl. Beside her, Alda whispered, "She'll never rise again." 2 men stepped forward, grasping Mara by the arms. They led her into the shallows, the fog clinging to their legs. Then, with a final prayer and no farewell, they pushed her into the river. Time slowed. Mara disappeared beneath the surface. The water trembled. A ripple spread, and then she floated. A gasp rippled through the crowd. "She is guilty," someone muttered. "She is a whore," hissed another. Ellen's heart beat faster. She wanted to scream that it meant nothing, that floating or sinking proved nothing, but her voice stuck in her throat, dry as hay. Father Thorn stepped forward, blessing the outcome. Let her be taken. The gods hauled Mara from the river, shivering and soaked. Her lips were blue, but her eyes still burned with disbelief. That night, she was taken away. No one saw her again. That winter, the fog came earlier. The bells rang less. And Ellen began to dream of water black, endless and cold. In her dreams, she walked into it willingly, her arms open, as if greeting an old friend. And somewhere in the distance, she always heard a woman singing, softly. From beneath the river surface, winter crept over the village like a slow exhale from the earth. The air thickened with wood smoke and silence, and even the crows stopped calling before the sun dipped below the tree line. The river, ever still, now froze at its edges, locking the reeds in white sheets like bones in frostbitten skin. In the loom house, Ellen worked longer hours, though her fingers ached and her eyes blurred by dusk. The women no longer gossiped while they wove. No songs were hummed. Laughter had thinned like mist after dawn. The trial of Mara lingered in the air, unspoken but ever present, a thread sewn into every whisper, every hesitant glance. Alda Tuvu had trended. She no longer waited by the fire at the bakery when Ellen passed in the morning. She no longer pulled her along to the frozen pond to throw stones or trace nonsense shapes in the snow. She had grown quiet, distracted. Her eyes, once fiery with mischief, now darted like a mouse beneath the hawk's shadow. It was 3 days after the solstice when Ellen finally asked. They sat in Alda's kitchen, the warmth from the oven barely touching their chilled hands. A single candle flickered between them, throwing long shadows onto the stone walls. You haven't smiled in weeks, Ellen said softly. Alda looked down at the crust she hadn't touched. Her voice came out small. He saw me. Who? Father Thorn. I took a book from the trader's cart last month. It had pictures, saints and sinners, a page about the moon's pull on water and how it stirs the blood. She swallowed. He saw me reading it by the fire. Ellen's stomach turned cold. That's not a crime. Alda shook her head. To you, maybe. But the church thinks otherwise. Women aren't meant to read about tides, or blood, or thoughts that don't come from sermons. She paused, then whispered, He's been watching me since. A hush fell between them, broken only by the soft pop of embers in the oven. Ellen reached across the table, grasping Alda's cold fingers. You've done nothing wrong. But they both knew that meant nothing anymore. That night, Ellen couldn't sleep. She lay beneath her wool blankets, staring at the low beams of the ceiling, listening to the wind clawing at the shutters. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, then went silent. Her mind drifted to the river, to Mara, to the way the crowd had turned, not with grief, not with doubt, but with certainty. A certainty sharper than any blade, forged not from proof, but fear. She remembered her dream again, the water, the song beneath it, the sound of breathing where there should have been none. And then, with a clarity that struck her like a cold breath, they would come for Alda. She sat up in the dark. By the next morning, her plan was formed. Ellen packed a bundle of bread, smoked fish, and a wool shawl. At midday, under the guise of delivering cloth to the chapel, she slipped away from the main road and crept along the tree line until she reached the back of the bakery. Alda was kneading dough alone, her hair pinned up, flour dusting her cheeks like pale ash. Ellen tapped on the window. Alda turned, her eyes wide with both relief and fear. You shouldn't be here. I'm not staying long. You have to leave. Alda's hands trembled. Leave? Where would I go? There's forest, then marsh, then wolves and gods. No, what? There's a village past the western wood. My uncle passed through it once. They don't have priests like ours. No river trials, no watching eyes. Alda stepped back, shaking her head. They'll know I ran. They'll say it proves guilt. My family will be punished. I'll say you went north. I'll give them a name. A false one. Anything. Alda stared at her for a long time. Then slowly, her lip quivered. They'll call you a liar. They already do, Ellen said, trying to smile. They just haven't said it yet. The sky dimmed earlier that day, clouds pregnant with snow. Ellen stayed at the loom until nightfall, returning home with reddened fingers and a hollow ache in her chest. She spoke little to her father. He was not unkind, but grief had made him distant, carved hollow spaces into him that never refilled. That night, the bell rang. Once. Then again. Ellen froze, the bread in her hand falling to the floor. A name was spoken in the square. la brum. Her throat closed. In the square, torches glowed like stars fallen to earth. The villagers murmured, their faces obscured by cloaks and hoods. Father Thorn stood at the center, holding aloft a parchment. She was found lacking in virtue, in obedience. And now she is lacking in presence, he said, voice ringing out like a blade drawn in silence. The river shall wait. If she does not return, she will be judged in absence. A punishment, a shame, a warning. Ellen stepped back into the shadows, her fingers clenched. And though no one said it aloud, many looked her way, as if the river, so hungry for truth, might shift its gaze next. It snowed for 3 days. Heavy, unrelenting flakes buried the fields, smothered the roads, and clung like silence to every rooftop. The church bell did not ring, the blackbirds vanished. And the river, that old mouth of judgment, froze so still it looked like glass laid over a dark and bottomless eye. Ellen did not leave her cottage for 2 of those days. She claimed illness to her father, and he accepted it wordlessly. In truth, she did not trust her legs to carry her into the square, did not trust her voice, not to betray her grief. Alda was gone, fled, safe, she hoped. But her absence hung like a scent, something the villagers could not name, yet sniffed at in every shadow. By the 3rd morning, Ellen returned to the loom house. The other women did not greet her. They wove quietly, their eyes fixed on threads, on hands, on anything that wasn't her. She tried to hum, out of habit, the old song about the summer wind in the flax fields, but her voice died in her throat before the 2nd note. She finished her shift early and walked home alone, snow crunching beneath her boots like bones. That evening, a knock sounded at the door. It wasn't loud, just 2 firm raps, but it froze the marrow in Ellen's bones. Her father opened it. Standing there was Edric, the young apprentice to the village scribe. He was no older than 20, lanky and pale, with ink-stained fingers and a nervous way of blinking. He bowed slightly. Ellen is needed, he said. The father wishes to speak with her. Her father looked at her, puzzled. Ellen stood very still. Now? Edric nodded. Before night prayers. Her father stepped aside without a word. Ellen dressed quietly, wrapping her shawl tighter than she ever had before, and followed Edric through the frozen streets. The air bit at her cheeks. Windows glowed with firelight, but no one watched from them. The entire village seemed to have turned inward, waiting. The church was cold. Though candles burned along the altar, the air inside was like stone, heavy and unmoving. Father Thorn stood near the pulpit, his back to her. He did not turn when she entered. Ellen, he said, voice soft, almost kindly. Come. She stepped forward. You know why you're here? No, she answered, but her voice was too quiet. You were close with Aldebrum. Yes. She has fled. Ah, pause. Ellen met his eyes. She was afraid. Afraid of what? Ellen hesitated. Of being misunderstood. Father Thorn tilted his head, only the guilty fear being seen. She wasn't guilty. His voice turned slightly, not louder, but colder. Do you think you know better than the church? I think I knew her better than you did. Silence. Then he stepped down from the altar and walked slowly toward her. You defended her, he said. I was her friend. You lie, he said softly. You helped her escape. Ellen's breath caught. No, his gaze did not waver. Lying is a sin, Ellen. I'm not. You withheld knowledge. That, too, is sin. She backed up half a step, the cold from the stone floor reaching her through her shoes. Father Thorn drew a breath, as if collecting himself. This village has rules, not out of cruelty, out of necessity, out of mercy. If you saw signs of her turning, you should have spoken. You could have saved her soul. She was never lost. Then why run? I don't know. He studied her for a long time. Then he nodded once and motioned to Edric, who had stood silent by the door. Escort her home. Nothing more was said. But the way Edric looked at her, now eyes slightly wider, jaw tight, told her all she needed to know. That night, she did not sleep. Her father did not ask questions. He rarely did. But she saw the concern in his hands, the way he carved his barrel staves too deeply, the way he stared into the fire long after the wood had turned to ash. Outside, the wind howled. Ellen lay awake, eyes fixed on the ceiling beams once again. But this time, no dream of water came. No voice beneath the river called her. Only the silence pressed in thick, breathless, watchful. She rose before dawn and walked to the river. The path was barely visible in the snow, but her feet knew it too well. Past the broken fence, past the ash tree that never bloomed, down the slope where moss grew fat in spring and brittle in winter. The river was frozen solid now, but still it seemed to move beneath the ice. She stood at its edge, staring down. A ripple of wind brushed her cheek. "I did nothing," she whispered. The river, of course, did not answer. When she returned to the village, a crow was perched on the roof of the loom house, watching, waiting. The women did not greet her that day either. When she sat to weave, someone had already placed a new bundle of thread on her bench, but not white or gray or flaxen gold. This thread was black, deep, and shining like the surface of the mire water in spring. She stared at it for a long time. Then, silently, she began to weave. 3 nights after her meeting with Father Thorn, the dreams returned. Ellen stood at the river's edge, no longer frozen, but running black and endless beneath a pale moon. The trees swayed like mourning women, and the air held the scent of iron and old prayers. Somewhere across the water, she saw a figure standing in the fog, arms open, eyes closed, singing. The song was not joyful, nor was it sad. It was something older than either a song that sounded like waiting. When Ellen tried to call out, her voice broke apart in the wind. She stepped into the water. The cold seized her lungs. She woke with a start, her breath shallow, the blanket damp from sweat. The fire had gone out. It was still dark, not yet dawn, but she did not try to sleep again. By morning, word had spread like thaw water through dry reeds. The priest would conduct a sermon of repentance. Not on the Sabbath, but on this very afternoon. An unusual choice. One that made hearts tighten and whispers rise in every cottage. Ellen said nothing to her father, but she saw the way his brow furrowed and his carving knife paused over the rim of the barrel. He didn't stop her when she left the house early. The chapel filled slowly, the air thick with a strange expectation. Families came dressed in silence. Children held close. Even the baker's cat seemed to walk warily under the pews. At the front, candles were already lit, their flames flickering slightly, though no breeze stirred. Father Thorn waited in full vestments. His hands were folded neatly. His eyes swept the crowd without blinking. When the doors closed, he spoke. "We gather not to accuse, but to cleanse. Ah, pauser. There are hearts among us burdened with guilt. Not guilt proven, but guilt unspoken. And what remains unspoken may fester. It is time," he said, "for the wound to bleed clean." No one moved. No one breathed. Let those who have faltered come forward. Let those who have seen sin and held it in silence rise. Stillness. Then, one by one, eyes turned toward Ellen. Some hesitantly, others with conviction. One woman, older, placed a trembling hand to her chest and looked away. Ellen felt it all, like invisible cords tightening around her. She did not stand, but she felt her cheeks burn. She heard the shuffling of feet as people began whispering behind their hands. It did not matter that she had no crime. It did not matter that she had spoken no heresy, sung no dark lullaby, nor mixed any herb beneath the wrong moon. What mattered was the silence she had kept. What mattered was Alda. When the sermon ended, Ellen walked home slowly. The snow had turned to slush, gray and thick beneath her boots. The river was still silent, but the thaw had begun. That night, a petition was written. She saw it being nailed to the chapel board the next morning, a list of names. Not signatures, but accusers. A dozen hands, perhaps more. Some lines were scrawled, others neat and confident. Ellen's name sat alone at the top. Her father said nothing when he saw it, but he poured an extra log into the fire and touched her shoulder when he passed, just once, as though he knew he would not be allowed to do so again. By the second evening, 2 of the village men came to the house. Not guards, just neighbors. Good men, once. Men who had bought barrels from her father and shared bread at the harvest table. They stood in the doorway with downcast eyes. "She must come," one of them said. Ellen did not cry. She packed nothing. She only kissed her father on the cheek, one last time, and whispered, "Don't come to the river." The trial was set for dawn. They tied her wrists, though she did not resist. Dressed her in a thin shift, though the air still held winter's chill. Father Thorn read no prayer this time, only silence. Only frost on grass and the croaking call of a raven far off in the trees. The villagers gathered in their cloaks, forming a circle around the banks. Children were held back. Some mothers wept. Some men did not raise their eyes at all. Ellen walked barefoot through the snow. She saw the water. It had broken through the ice, just enough. 2 men stood ready at the edge, the same as always. The same who had pushed Mara into the river. She looked at them calmly. "I'm not guilty," she said. One of them shifted on his feet. Father Thorn lifted his hand. "The water will know." Then they stepped forward, and the world fell away. The water was colder than Ellen had ever imagined. It wasn't just the cold of snowmelt or spring thaw. It was the cold of things forgotten, the cold of ancient silence, the kind that seeps into the skin and doesn't leave. It closed around her like a second skin, numbing her limbs, blurring the beat of her heart until she could no longer tell if it still thudded in her chest. For one suspended moment, Ellen floated, just beneath the surface, not rising, not sinking. The current was slow but deliberate, curling around her wrists, her ankles, tugging gently as if trying to decide what to do with her. Above her, the villagers watched in silence. They saw the shape of her body beneath the surface, her pale gown drifting like seaweed, her hair fanning out like ink spilled in water. Some whispered, some held their breath. Others, like Father Thorn, stared with hollow eyes, waiting. She had not screamed. She had not begged, and now she neither rose nor fell. Time, it seemed, forgot how to move. Then something shifted. A current beneath the surface pulled at her more firmly. Not toward the bank, but down. She sank, just an inch, then another. And then, slowly, her form disappeared beneath the dark, rippling water. There was a shout. 2 men rushed into the river, breaking through the reeds, plunging through the freezing shallows. One grabbed at where she'd been. The other dove blindly, arms flailing in the murk. A splash, a cough, a tangle of limbs. Then, Ellen's body was pulled from the water, limp and cold, her head lolling to the side, hair clinging to her face like wet silk. She was not breathing. They laid her on the grass. Her skin was bluer than the sky above. Her lips parted but gave no sound. A woman wept. Someone whispered a prayer. Father Thorn stepped forward, his face unreadable. "She is innocent," he said, voice trembling with something like awe. "God has claimed her." But God had not claimed her. Not yet. Deep within her chest, past the slowing pulse, past the fading light in her mind, something remained. Something that remembered the warmth of Alda's laughter, the hush of wind through flax fields, the feel of her father's hand resting on her shoulder that final night. And in that place, that small, flickering place, Ellen heard a voice. It wasn't a voice she recognized, nor was it speaking in words she understood, but it was there. Gentle, low, like a song hummed through stone. It filled her lungs without breath. It stirred her fingers without motion. And in that space between death and waking, Ellen saw faces. Not the villagers, not Father Thorn, but women, scores of them standing in dark water up to their waists, all looking at her. Their eyes were solemn. Some wept. Others simply waited. Their gowns were the color of moonlight and moss. Their hair clung to their cheeks. And one by one, they raised their hands. Ellen reached back and gasped. Her body jolted. Water spilled from her mouth in a violent cough. Her eyes flew open, blinded by the light. The world tilted. She rolled to her side, gagging, the cold clawing at her lungs. Her ears rang. Her fingers twitched. Somewhere nearby, someone cried out in disbelief. "She breathes." Father Thorn froze mid-blessing. The 2 men who had dragged her from the water staggered backward, crossing themselves. Ellen coughed again. Blood-tinged water stained the snow beside her. "She lives," someone whispered. "No one survives," another muttered. The priest stepped forward, face white. "Witchcraft," someone said behind him. But others remained silent, because what they had seen was not ordinary. The river had taken her, and then given her back. They did not imprison her. Not yet. But they did not let her go free either. Ellen was carried to the old chapel house and laid upon a straw pallet. The room was bare, save for a narrow window and an unlit candle. A girl from the village young, no more than 10, was told to watch her. Not tend her, just watch. Report if anything unnatural happened. By dusk, her fever rose. Her limbs trembled beneath the thin blankets, and her breaths came in shallow bursts. Yet in her mind, she was not in the room. She was beneath water again, standing among those silent women who watched her not with judgment, but with something stranger, recognition. She tried to speak to them in the dream, but her mouth would not open. Only Her thoughts reached them. Why am I here? One of the women stepped forward. She had gray hair plaited with bone, and her eyes were deep wells of memory. The woman lifted her hand and pointed behind Ellen, Elunturnd, and saw herself floating once again, but not alone. Alda was there too. So was Mara, and behind them, hundreds more. Not dead, not alive, waiting. She woke just after midnight, breathless, the fever breaking in a cold sweat that drenched her skin. The candle in the room had somehow lit itself, and the little girl who'd been watching her, gone. Only the chair remained, empty. And in the silence of that narrow chapel room, Ellen whispered for the first time since the trial, I saw them. The candle's flame danced slowly, though no draught stirred in the chapel room. Its light cast strange shapes across the stone walls, warping the shadows of the simple furniture into long, slithering things. Ellen sat upright on the pallet, her skin clammy and her shift damp against her spine. Her breath came easier now, though each inhale still tasted faintly of river mud and metal. She touched her chest, her heart still beat, slow but steady. The little girl never returned. Ellen waited until the candle burned halfway down, its wax dribbling in thin trails across the windowsill. Then she stood, her bare feet silent on the cold floor. Outside the narrow window, the village lay beneath the stillness of night, no footsteps, no prayers, no movement but the drifting mist. She opened the chapel door. The wind met her gently, brushing her face like a mother's cooling hand. Snow had fallen again, a thin dusting that muted every surface, softened every line. She walked without purpose at first, each footstep a whisper. No one saw her. No one stopped her. But her feet knew the way. They led her down the slope beyond the chapel, past the old oak that had grown crooked from too many winters, past the shrine to St. Rhine, whose face had long since worn away, and then to the river. The mire water no longer roared, no longer moved with any urgency. It sat still, coiled in its banks, like a sleeping beast. Ellen stood at its edge once more. She didn't speak aloud. Her voice felt foreign, misplaced in such a place. Instead, she closed her eyes and listened. Not to the trees or the wind, but to what lived beneath the silence. And slowly, like a veil being drawn back the water, remembered. She saw them again. The drowned. Not just Mara, not just Alda. Hundreds, maybe more. Standing beneath the surface, not floating nor falling, just waiting. Their faces were not twisted in horror. No agony marred their expressions. There was only stillness and an unbearable quiet that filled Ellen's chest like sorrow that had no place to go. One of them stepped forward. She was younger than the others, no more than 12. Her eyes were wide and dark, her mouth a pale slash beneath uncombed hair. She raised her hand slowly and pointed behind Ellen, Elunturnd, and found herself back in the village square. But it was not the present. It was memory, or prophecy, or something in between. She saw herself standing in the center of the square, ropes around her wrists again. But this time, the crowd was smiling, not cruelly, almost kindly, as if they believed they were offering her a gift. Father Thorne spoke, but his voice was not his own. It was hollow. It echoed, like wind in a tomb. She was chosen. Ah, pause. For what must come next? Ellen gasped and stumbled backward. She was no longer by the river. She had fallen to her knees near the base of the old shrine. Snow clung to her lashes. Her hands trembled. Was she dreaming? Was she still caught in the world between? Before she could rise, a voice spoke from behind. You shouldn't be here. She turned. It was Edric, the scribe's apprentice. He held a lantern, the glow catching on the silver threads in his scarf. His eyes always nervous before now held something harder. Not suspicion, but fear. You're not supposed to leave the chapel, he said. I wasn't told that, she replied softly. He hesitated. They think you're cursed. She stood slowly, brushing snow from her knees. Then why not burn me? His mouth parted in surprise. He didn't answer. Ellen looked past him toward the faint light of the village. I drowned. He blinked. We saw. But I came back. He nodded. Ellen took a step closer, her voice low. Do you think I was meant to? I don't know, he said, but they're afraid you were. She studied him for a moment. Are you? Ah, pause. Then, softly, no. He lowered his gaze, ashamed. You should go back, he added. They'll come for you again. Maybe not tomorrow, but soon. Why? Because they don't understand what the river gave back. That night, Ellen returned to the chapel, but not to sleep. She sat beside the cold hearth, her knees pulled to her chest, watching the shadows shift as the candle's light waned. Somewhere beneath her skin, she felt a stirring, not pain, not fear, but a strange certainty, like something ancient had awakened and now stretched inside her. She was no longer just a girl who had floated. She was a witness, a vessel. The drowned had shown her faces, voices buried in silence. And now she understood the weight of returning. In the early hours before dawn, the girl who had been set to watch her returned. She crept into the chapel, barefoot and pale, her eyes wide and unblinking. Elun looked up. "I didn't tell them," the child whispered. "Tell them what? That you disappeared?" Ellen tilted her head. "Why not?" The girl took a step closer. "Because my sister's in the river." Ellen's breath caught. "She went in last winter," the girl said. "They said she was a sinner, but I saw her, last night, in my dream." She was singing. Ellen reached for the girl's hand, and in that quiet moment, surrounded by stone and candlelight, the river flowed between them not with water, but with memory. And with the first calling, the next morning, no one came to check on Ellen. Not the priest, not the girl, not even Edric, who had watched her with something close to mercy. It was as if the village had collectively agreed to forget she existed, or worse, had decided she no longer belonged to them. She sat in the chapel doorway, wrapped in a heavy wool cloak someone had left folded near the cot, and stared at the snow-covered roofs beyond the stone wall. The world continued, but it moved differently now, as if muffled beneath a thick blanket of fear. Chickens still pecked in yards, and smoke still curled from chimneys, but no children played, no doors stayed open, and the church bell rang just once that day, not a call to prayer, but a reminder. She is still among you. Ellen wandered through the chapel, trailing her fingers along the stone. The building had always frightened her as a child, not because of its silence, but because of how much it held. Regret, guilt, secrets layered beneath the hymns. She stopped before the altar, where Father Thorn once placed a silver basin of water before every sermon. Now it stood empty. Dry. She reached in and touched the bottom. Smooth, cold metal. Something pulsed under her fingers. She jerked her hand back, but the feeling remained a soft echo in her palm, like the heartbeat of a creature buried deep underground. By midday, the girl returned. She did not speak at first. She stood in the doorway, clutching her shawl, her eyes uncertain. "I dreamed again," she said finally. Ellen nodded. She sang louder this time. "Your sister?" The girl nodded. She was standing in the water, but her feet didn't touch the bottom. She said, "You would understand." Ellen stood, stepping carefully across the uneven stones. "What else did she say?" "She told me her name." The girl's lip trembled. "It's Ilna. I'd forgotten. I was so small." Ellen knelt in front of her, brushing the hair from her cheek. "She remembers you." "I think she's cold," the girl whispered. Ellen looked toward the chapel window, where the frost gathered like feathers on the glass. "She's not the only one." That evening, Ellen left again, this time with purpose. She wore the same cloak, though it did little to guard against the wind slicing down from the hills. The snow had hardened into brittle ice underfoot, and each step echoed like a warning. She did not go to the river. She went to the old scribe's house. Edric opened the door before she knocked. His face was drawn and pale, as though he too had not slept. "I thought you might come," he said. "I need the records," she replied. "The ones Father Thorn keeps hidden." He stepped aside without a word. Inside, the room smelled of wax and parchment. Shelves lined the walls, sagging with bound volumes. Candles burned low, their light flickering across ink bottles and quills. On a small desk lay a stack of leather-bound ledgers, each marked with a year and a symbol, some crosses, some circles, some small, jagged stars. Edric pulled one from the bottom of the stack. "This one," he said. "The year the river took 5 women." Ellen opened it carefully. The pages were filled with narrow script, neat, measured, merciless. Mara Willen, age 34, found guilty by sign of floating. No confession. Ilna Bray, age 13, accused of night, walking, claimed visions, drowned. Sela Orin, age 22, midwife, possessed unblessed herbs, and more. Names, ages, accusations as thin as fog. "Do they all?" Ellen began. Edric nodded. "They all went into the water. None returned." Ellen touched Ilna's name. She was a child. She was different, he said. Like you. They stood in silence a while. Then Edric said softly, "There's a passage in the older book, a reference to the first to return. Elundturned. Not the first to survive, the first to come back carrying something with her." He reached into a side drawer and pulled out a tattered volume, its pages more fragile, stained with age. He flipped carefully until he found the line. "And if the river shall yield one not taken, she shall bear the voices of the drowned in her marrow. She shall be marked, not cursed, not blessed, but burdened." Ellen closed her eyes. The voices, the dreams, the feeling that her body did not belong entirely to her anymore. "They speak through me," she whispered, "but not with words, not yet." Edric looked at her. "Will you let them speak?" he asked. She didn't answer. But when she left the scribe's house, she carried the old ledger beneath her cloak against her heart. That night, sleep didn't come. She sat before the hearth in the chapel, the ledger open on her knees. The candlelight cast each name in golden shadow. Ellen traced the names with her fingertips, memorizing them, breathing them in. Mara, Ilna, Sela, Gerda, Liss. Each woman had vanished into the river, and the village had simply moved on, cleansed their guilt with prayers, washed their hands in silence. But the river had not forgotten, and now neither would she. Just before dawn, she dreamed again. She stood in the chapel, but it was filled with water, floor to ceiling. The pews were covered in moss. The windows wept slowly, and the altar bled dark droplets into the current. She stood alone, until one by one the women emerged from the shadows, floating in the flooded chapel, their faces calm. Ilna was there, smiling. So was Mara, her hair trailing behind her like black silk. They did not speak, but Ellen heard them not with ears, but with the very bones of her being. And this time she understood. The river did not drown them. The village did. Morning came gray and brittle. The sky offered no sun, only a dull smear of light that made the snow look dirty and old. Smoke from the chimneys rose without direction, curling in odd shapes before fading. It was the kind of day where even the bells didn't dare ring. Ellen left the chapel before anyone stirred. The ledger was bound beneath her cloak again, its weight more familiar now than cloth or warmth. It no longer felt like a book. It felt like a voice, heavy with all the words no one had dared speak aloud. She walked through the village as though invisible. The baker's shutters were drawn tight. The smith's fire hadn't been lit. A dog barked once from behind a fence and then fell silent. No one looked out to see her pass. They knew she walked among them again, but no one dared claim her as one of their own. At the edge of the square, she stopped. There, nailed to the post beneath the chapel bell, was a new parchment. The wind tugged at its corners, but the ink was still fresh. The girl has not confessed. The girl does not kneel. She walks still in flesh, but not in spirit. Beware her tongue, and beware her eyes, for they carry the river's shadow. It was not signed. It didn't need to be. The village had spoken, not with names, but with fear. And fear was always louder than truth. Ellen tore the parchment down. She didn't shout, didn't cry. She simply folded it, tucked it into the ledger, and walked on. By midday, she stood again at the riverbank. The mire water was still, as ever, mirror flat, thick with memory. But today she did not come to look. She came to speak. She opened the ledger and set it upon a flat stone. Then, slowly, she began to read the names, one by one, carefully, clearly, as though speaking them aloud would rebuild the world. Mara Willen, she said. Ilna Brai, Sela Ohing, Gerda Lorn, Lies of the Weavers, Thena of the Mill, Brylan Forth, Nera Wither. She read for almost an hour. No wind stirred, no birds sang, but the air around her changed. It thickened, subtly like breath in a closed room. And though the river gave no ripple, Ellen felt something shift beneath her feet. Not danger, not power, recognition. When the sun reached its highest, a dull disk behind a veil of cloud footsteps approached from the trees. Elundund. It was Father Thorn. He did not come alone. Behind him, 3 men from the village followed. One held a length of rope. Another carried a flask of blessed oil. The third held a cross carved from bone. Ellen did not move. Thorn's face held no anger, only weariness, and something else, pity, perhaps, though twisted by duty. "You've wandered too far," he said. "I never left," Ellen replied softly. You speak of the dead. They asked me to. You read forbidden records. They were already forgotten. You speak names better left buried. They were never buried, only drowned. He stepped closer, boots crunching in the half-frozen mud. They'll say I failed, he said quietly, that I let rot creep into the grain. You did, she said, but not by silence. He looked at her, and for a breath, just one, he seemed unsure. But then he raised his hand. Ellen of the village, you are to be silenced, until your tongue forgets the river, until your eyes forget the names. The men behind him stepped forward. Ellen did not run, but she did something else. She spoke not with her own voice, but with the layered echo of many. She remembers. The men froze. Ellen's mouth moved, but the words were not hers. The cadence was older, broken, weeping. She remembers me, came a voice like wind in dead leaves. And me, said another. One of the men dropped the rope and staggered backward. Her bones know, whispered the third voice. Her hands remember our drowning. Father Thorn paled. Ellen stepped forward. Not in rage, not in defiance, but in mourning. You asked for silence, she said, her voice her own once more. But silence doesn't bury truth, it only feeds it. The priest raised the cross, trembling. She is possessed. No, came a voice behind them. It was the little girl. She stood barefoot at the tree line, her dress too thin for the cold. She speaks for my sister. Ellen turned. Others stood behind her now. A dozen, maybe more. Villagers, silent, not all brave, but present, watching. And somehow, that was enough. Father Thorn lowered the cross. The men stepped back, and Ellen, ledger in hand, walked past them, back into the village, not as the accused, not yet as the avenged, but as the one who remembered. And somewhere, far beneath the mire water, the river flowed a little faster. The days that followed were not loud. There were no uprisings, no shattered doors, no cries of rebellion. The village did not gather in crowds, nor did anyone openly speak Ellen's name. But something deeper, quieter, began to move beneath the surface of things, like rot in a beam, like river water seeping into stone. Ellen was not taken again. No rope, no trial, no summons. She was not welcomed either. She walked through the lanes of the village with the careful presence of someone both seen and unseen as shadow at noon. Children watched her from windows. Old women crossed themselves when she passed. But others simply nodded, softly, subtly, as though they too had begun to remember. In the evenings, Ellen returned to the chapel, not to pray, but to read. The ledger had become her ritual, each name a kind of sacred act, each story a resurrection. Edric continued to bring her fragments of old records, buried beneath firewood, hidden behind loose bricks in the scriptorium. One evening, he brought her a torn scrap of parchment, edges singed, words faded. It bore a single line. The drowned do not sleep. They wait, not for vengeance, for memory. She copied it carefully onto the back of the ledger, and then, as the candlelight flickered against the frost-laced window, she whispered, I remember you. On morning, onokukame. Not the kind that demanded, but the kind that asked. Ellen opened the chapel door to find a woman standing there, thin, cloaked in ash-gray wool, eyes sunken from years of hunger and smoke. Her name was Hester, the widow of a tanner who'd been lost to fever 3 winters ago. My daughter, she said. They say she laughs in her sleep. They say she speaks of dreams beneath the water. Ellen said nothing. Hester lowered her eyes. They'll come for her, Ellen. Not yet, but soon. Ellen stepped aside. The woman entered. And thus began the quiet procession. Over the next days, more came. A young shepherd whose wife had vanished after being seen plucking herbs from a field. An old man whose sister had once bled for days after childbirth and been accused of harboring demons. 2 boys who claimed they had heard songs from the well behind the schoolhouse. They did not ask for miracles. They asked for names. And Ellen gave them carefully, one by one, from the ledger, from the echoes in her bones, from the voices that still drifted to her in sleep. The chapel became a place of memory, not worship, not salvation, but memory. And memory, it seemed, was its own kind of rebellion. Then, one night, she heard the floor creak, not under her own steps, not the wind. She stood from the pallet and stepped into the nave, where moonlight spilled through the broken pane and the stained glass. A figure stood there, just beyond the altar. Not a ghost, not a priest, but a girl, Ilna. She was clearer now than ever before. Not a flicker of dream, but something closer to presence, her feet bare, her hair damp as if she had just climbed from the river. Her lips moved, but no sound came. Elun knelt. I remember you, she said. Ilna stepped closer. She pointed toward the altar, the place where Father Thorn had once poured water into a silver basin, where countless names had been buried beneath the sound of prayer. Eluntund. She stepped to the altar and placed her hand flat upon the wood. It was cold, but something beneath it was warm. She pressed harder, and a soft click answered her. The panel gave way. A drawer slid open, long, narrow, hidden within the altar's frame. Inside were scrolls, dozens of them, bound with leather cords, marked with the sigil of the church. Ellen lifted one with trembling hands and unrolled it. Names, not of saints, not of tithes, but of the accused. A second list, one never meant to be read. She stayed up all night, transcribing, weeping, each name a thread, each accusation a stone. But in her hands, they became something else, a chain of light, stitching the forgotten back into the fabric of the living. By the time the sun rose, her eyes ached and her fingers were stiff. But the ledger was heavier, not in weight, in meaning. Outside, snow had begun again, light and fine, like ash drifting from a long-dead fire. Ellen stood at the chapel door, watching. And for the first time since she had risen from the river, she did not feel alone. She felt surrounded not by enemies, not yet by allies, but by a great stirring presence. A tide turning not with rage, but with something slower, more dangerous. Remembrance. And beneath her feet, the stones of the chapel floor seemed to shift ever so slightly, as if the earth itself had begun to listen. There was a room beneath the chapel. Ellen found it by accident, or perhaps by invitation. She had noticed a stone tile near the altar that echoed hollowly underfoot, unlike the others. When she pressed her weight into it, it shifted ever so slightly, just enough to catch her breath. Beneath the tile was a narrow stair, steep and winding, descending into darkness. She lit a taper and stepped into the earth. The room was not large. Bare walls of packed dirt, a low ceiling. No altar, no windows, no sacred symbols. Only shelves, dozens of them, filled with scrolls, broken icons, scraps of fabric stained with oil or blood. But what stopped her were the boxes. Plain wooden boxes, stacked 2 or 3 high, each marked with initials and dates. Her fingers trembled as she opened one. Inside, locks of hair, a bracelet, a child's boot, a bloodstained scarf. Nothing holy, nothing powerful. Just the remains of lives erased. Each box was a memory kept in secret. A hidden archive of those the church had condemned, not just for heresy or witchcraft, but for being inconvenient. Too loud, too clever, too different. Ellen knelt on the floor and wept not loudly, but with the quiet devastation of someone realizing that forgetting had been a choice all along, and someone, long ago, had tried to remember. That night, she brought down a blank ledger. She began writing, not just names, stories. Whatever she could find, notes scribbled on old cloth, letters never sent, testimonies hidden between the cracks of the chapel walls. She titled it, The Book of What Was Lost. And every page she filled made her feel a little heavier and somehow a little stronger. Word began to spread not by mouth but by movement. Lanterns burned later in windows near the chapel. A mother brought bread and left it without knocking. A boy, no older than 10, slipped her a torn ribbon and whispered, "It was my aunt's. They said she talked to birds." Another girl came with a bone carving a small fox and whispered, "My brother made this before they took him." None of them stayed, but none of them ran. Ellen accepted everything. She stored each item in the boxes beneath the chapel, adding pages to the book with every new gift. She was building a record not of accusation, but of existence. And that, more than anything, was what the village had been denied for generations, the right to exist beyond silence. Then came the knock she had been waiting for. A slow, hesitant sound. Not angry, not afraid. Ellen opened the chapel door. It was Father Thorn. His robe was damp with snow, his eyes sunken and rimmed with sleeplessness. He did not carry a cross. He did not raise his voice. He simply looked tired. "I've seen them," he said. Ellen didn't ask who. He stepped inside. His boots left wet tracks on the stone. He walked past the pews, toward the altar, and stopped there, staring down. "The river spoke once," he murmured. "Many years ago, I was a boy, barely ordained. A woman, her name was Marin, she floated. But she did not drown. She clawed her way back." He looked at Ellen. She screamed your name. Ellen's breath caught. "But I wasn't." "Not your name," he said, "but the sound of it. Close, like an echo sent forward." He rubbed his eyes. "They silenced her. Quicker than you. No trial. Just gone." There was a long pause. "You were never supposed to return," he whispered. "I did," Ellen said, "and so did the others." He sat in the front pew, as if suddenly too old to stand. "I don't know what I believe anymore." "You don't have to," she said, "but you have to listen." He nodded slowly, then rose and left. That night, the snow came heavier than it had all winter. The chapel groaned under the weight of it, wind howling through the rafters like a forgotten prayer. But Ellen did not light a fire. She wrapped herself in cloaks and sat beside the open ledger, letting the wind carry the voices around her. They were louder now, clearer, not angry, but insistent. They wanted to be heard not to accuse, but to warn. Something was coming. Something older than the river. Something that remembered before the trials, before the fear, before even the faith that had become so twisted by men in robes. And in her bones, Ellen knew, if the village did not remember willingly, it would remember through loss. At dawn, she took the book of what was lost and placed it on the chapel steps. She left it open to the page with Ilna's story, the girl who had dreamed beneath the water. And when the first villager passed, they stopped, read, and didn't walk away. By midday, 2 more stood beside them. By nightfall, someone had left a name written on cloth and tucked it beneath the open book. And when Ellen returned to bring it inside, she found another new offering in the doorway, a rusted bell with a note. She sang to the wind, "I should have listened." By the second week of snowfall, the chapel steps were no longer bare. The book of what was lost now rested atop a thick woven cloth to keep it from the damp. Villagers, those brave enough or those too tired to remain silent, came before dawn or just after dusk to kneel, to read, to leave something behind. No one spoke, but the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of fear, but of reverence of mourning, yes, but also of listening. Some brought names written in charcoal on bark. Others folded prayers into dried leaves and tucked them into the gaps of the stone wall. Someone carved a small wooden figure, a woman with her arms raised, her mouth open in mid-song, and placed it beside the book. Beneath it, a single word carved with care. Ilna. Ellen never stood guard. She didn't need to. The chapel no longer belonged to her alone. It belonged to memory and to those brave enough to carry it forward. She spent her nights in the stone cellar beneath the altar, sifting through boxes and parchments, writing long into the hours when wind screamed across the hills. The dreams returned more frequently now, not only of Ilna, but of others. Dozens, then hundreds. Some with faces she recognized from the ledger, others unknown. They stood in fields of black water, sat beneath trees whose roots reached into graves, walked through corridors made of bone and prayer. They never spoke in words, but Ellen understood them. They were preparing her. It was near midnight when Hester returned. The widow's cloak was soaked through with melted snow. Her hands trembled not from cold, but from something deeper. "They've taken her," she said. Ellen rose from her writing. "Who?" "My girl," Hester whispered. "They waited until I went to market. Said she laughed in her sleep again. Said she woke with wet hair. Said she was touched." Ellen steadied her. "Where is she now?" "In the schoolhouse. They've locked her in the old storeroom until Father Thorn returns from Denswick." Ellen felt a pressure behind her eyes, not tears, but heat. "How old is she?" she asked. 8. They went in silence. Hester led her through the back lanes, avoiding the square, the lanterns, the eyes. The snow muffled their footsteps as though the village itself wished not to wake. The schoolhouse loomed dark and low. Its door was bolted, but the back window still hung on a crooked hinge. Ellen slipped inside first. The storeroom was behind the old bookshelves, near the room where generations of children had learned not just letters, but obedience. A small voice came from within. "Hester?" the girl whispered. Ellen opened the door. She was curled in the corner, arms around her knees, her hair damp and tangled. "I'm Ellen," she said gently. The girl blinked. "The river lady." Ellen paused, Who told you that? You did, the girl said. In my dream. Hester gathered her into her arms, rocking her softly, whispering apologies. Ellen stood in the doorway, her body rigid with memory, not her own, but the weight of so many others who had never been pulled from locked rooms. They did not run. They returned to the chapel. And when dawn broke, the village found the child sitting calmly beside the book of what was lost, reading aloud the names written on the open page. She read them as if they were lullabies. The council met that evening. 6 elders, called from their homes, wrapped in layers of wool and suspicion. They sat in the chapel pews, fidgeting like men at a funeral. Ellen stood before them, the book in her arms. You locked a child away, she said. She's not like other children, one muttered. She speaks strangely, said another. She dreams of dead things, said a third. Ellen opened the book. She dreams of this, she said, of names you buried, of voices you silenced, of truth. The eldest among them, a man named Osric, leaned forward. And you, Ellen, what do you dream of? She met his gaze. I dream of a village that does not fear its own children. He looked away, but said no more. That night, a fire was lit in the square, not to destroy, but to warm. Villagers gathered around it quietly, holding scraps of parchment and cloth. One by one, they read names aloud not from the church's rolls, but from their own hearts. Brylan, my sister. Morin, my friend. Thorn, my mother's name, before she gave it up. Ilna Bray, I heard her sing. Even Father Thorn, returned from Denswick and silent in the crowd, did not interrupt. He stood with his arms folded, eyes closed, listening. And when Ellen stepped into the circle holding the book, the fire did not crack or spit. It leaned toward her, as if drawn by the very breath of her words. I do not bring punishment, she said. I bring memory. And memory, once lit, does not burn out. She placed the book beside the fire, and the wind did not take its pages. Snow fell in slow spirals through the smoke of the fire. Villagers lingered long after the last name was spoken. Some held hands, others stood alone, wrapped in silence. No one laughed, no one sang. But beneath the stillness, something stirred, not unrest, not yet, but awakening. Ellen stood at the edge of the firelight, the book of what was lost resting in her arms like a child. Its cover smelled of soot and old wood, its pages slightly singed at the corners from the night's heat. She had not expected so many voices, so many names, carried for so long in silence. And not just from the women. The men, 2 fathers, sons, brothers, had come to remember. Some spoke aloud. Others simply touched the book with their fingertips before stepping back into the dark. It was not absolution, but it was beginning. The next morning, Ellen awoke to find a line of stones placed across the chapel steps. At first, she thought them random, but when she looked closer, she saw that each one bore a mark carved or scratched, hurried but intentional. A flower, a sun, a circle, a child's handprint. One stone bore the symbol of the weavers. Another had the faint outline of a bird in flight. They weren't messages. They were memorials, tiny gravestones for those who'd had none. She knelt and touched one, a simple round stone with a line through its center. A name came unbidden to her lips, Nira. She did not know how she knew, but the river inside her did. That afternoon, Edric arrived with more parchment. He looked different now, thinner, more alert, as if memory had sharpened him. He no longer hesitated before entering the chapel. He walked as though it belonged to him, too. They're watching, he said quietly, setting down the scrolls. Who? Not the villagers, the ones from the abbey. Elune turned. The abbey knows? He nodded grimly. Denswick has ears. And eyes. They say heresy is spreading, that you've turned the chapel into a cult. Ellen didn't flinch. They're not wrong, she said, only about the name. They may send someone, Edric added, to cleanse what you've stirred. She looked out the window, toward the square, where a child was laying another stone near the chapel steps. Let them come, she said. That night, she dreamed of the river again. But it was no longer black. It was silver shining like moonlight on glass, and the women were no longer standing still. They were walking, slowly, calmly. Davart her. She stood on the bank, the book in her hands, the wind rushing over the pages. Ilna was among them, but now she smiled. Soon, the dream whispered, soon we return. Ellen woke with tears on her cheeks, not of fear, but of knowing. 2 days later, the man from the abbey arrived. He wore no robe, only a dark wool coat, thick gloves, and a pin in the shape of a lamb pierced by a sword. He said his name was Inquisitor Varick, but gave no title. He spoke little. He observed, watched the chapel from afar, noted the gathering at dusk, the offerings, the open book. It questioned no one. But his presence was like frost on early crops unseen, but deadly. On the 4th day, Varick approached Ellen. She was tending the fire inside the chapel, drying cloths left as offerings. "You've become a symbol," he said. She didn't look at him. "I became a memory." He stepped closer. "You've awakened something dangerous." "I've awakened something forgotten." "They will burn this down," he said. "The abbey, the cities, the crown. They will not allow it to spread." Ellen looked up. Her voice was steady. "Let them burn the stone. They can't burn what lives in breath." Varick's eyes narrowed. "You're not afraid." "I've already drowned," she said. "What's fire to water?" He didn't answer, only turned and walked out into the snow. That evening, she found a letter nailed to the chapel door. Short, cold, disband, denounce, awe, face, judgment. It bore the wax seal of the abbey. She took it down, folded it, placed it inside the book, and on the cover she wrote in new ink, "Let them come." That night, the villagers gathered again, this time not to mourn, but to choose. Some brought tools, others brought kindling, not to destroy, but to build. They dug out the snow behind the chapel and laid the first stones of what would become a second room, not hidden, but open to the sky, where names could be read under sunlight, not candlelight. Ellen watched in silence. The fire from within her matched the fire in their hands. And, far off, at the edge of the forest, the trees swayed, though there was no wind, as if the earth itself had begun to remember. The village held its breath, not literally, not in the way lungs seize when fear rises, but in a deeper, older way. Even the birds seemed quieter, the frost reluctant to melt, as if the world sensed something approaching, and chose stillness instead of resistance. In the mornings, the chapel bell no longer rang, not from brokenness, but from choice. Ellen had silenced it, not out of fear, but respect. There were enough voices now to fill the sky without brass. In the square, the snow had receded, giving way to damp earth and early moss. Children no longer whispered Ellen's name behind sleeves, they said it plainly, like a word that had shed its danger. Elders offered bread without lowering their eyes. Fathers walked their daughters to the chapel, holding their hands a little tighter than before. And the book? It had doubled in size. No longer just one volume, but 2 bound, side by side and resting in a wooden cradle carved by Osric himself, the eldest of the village council. He had not spoken publicly since the fire ceremony, but when he brought the cradle to the chapel, he said 5 simple words. Names deserve more than dust. But silence never stays generous for long. On the 12th day after the Inquisitor's warning, the road darkened. Not with storm, but with horses. 3 dozen riders came just after dawn, their armor dull beneath traveling cloaks, the sigils on their shoulders smudged with ash and salt. Behind them rolled a cart bearing barrels of oil and a tall wooden cross. Uncarved, unblessed, unclaimed. They bore no songs, only orders. At the head was Varick once more, no longer dressed in quiet wool but in robes of judgment red threaded with gold, a chain of iron scripture coiled at his waist. He did not ask permission. He read aloud. "In the name of the abbey," he said, his voice clean and cruel in the cold, "this gathering is declared heretical." No one moved. Not even the children. He stepped forward. "This chapel shall be dismantled. This book destroyed. These gatherings dispersed." He looked at Ellen. "And the one called the Riverborn shall surrender herself." Ellen stepped forward, not trembling, not bowed. She wore no white, no veil, no cloak of holy defiance. Only a dress dyed the color of wet stone, her hair loose around her shoulders, her hands ink-stained from names written just hours before. She said one word. No, the crowd stirred, but not with chaos, with clarity. One by one, they stepped forward, not to fight, not to plead, but to stand. A circle of flesh and memory around Ellen, not armed, not shouting, only present. A midwife, a mason, a boy no taller than the book's cradle. Even Osric, his bones stiff with age, placed himself between the soldiers and the chapel. Varick sneered. "Do you think you can stop the fire with silence?" Ellen met his eyes. "No," she said, "but silence is what built it. And now we remember. The soldiers did not move. Not yet. They waited for the order. For the flick of a hand. The raise of a sword. The word that would turn history into ash. Varric hesitated. Perhaps it was the steadiness in Ellen's gaze. Or the way the villagers didn't shout. Or the way the book sat quietly behind them, open to a page with only 2 words written large. We remember. That night, the soldiers made camp at the edge of the wood. They did not attack, not yet. They watched. Torches burned along the boundary. Horses pawed frozen earth. The villagers lit no fires, spoke in whispers, left nothing unattended. But inside the chapel, something brighter than flame burned. Ellen sat before the book, writing with fingers numb from cold, the ink thick as wine, the words flowing from a place she no longer controlled. Ilna had come again in her dream, but this time she had spoken. 3 words only. Let it come. And so, Ellen wrote them at the top of the page reserved for tomorrow. When the villagers returned to their homes that night, they did not weep. They sang, softly, old lullabies. Rhymes their mothers had hummed while stirring broth or weaving flax. Songs with no origin passed like spoons or scars. Varric heard it from the edge of camp. And for the first time in his life, he wondered if fire could kill something that had already taken root in the marrow. And in the forest, beyond the torchlight, beneath the roots of the ash trees older than abbeys, older than kings, the river flowed unseen not above the earth, but within it. And it, too, was waiting. The sun rose without warmth, a pale, indifferent disk, casting more shadow than light. Snow had melted into dark slush, and the wind carried with it a scent not born from hearths or cooking fires. It was the smell of oil. Ellen smelled it before she saw the barrels lined neatly along the perimeter of the square, their wooden staves stamped with the abbey's seal. A quiet warning, not yet flame, but the promise of it. The soldiers made no speeches. They stood in full armor now, not traveling cloaks, with visors down and swords strapped high. Their horses were restless. Their captain, a man with burn scars across his throat, gave orders in signs, not words. This was no longer a visit. It was a siege. Inside the chapel, the villagers gathered. Tighter this time, no longer out of curiosity, but out of refusal. Refusal to forget. Refusal to scatter. Ellen stood before the altar, the book of what was lost resting open before her, and said nothing. There was no sermon, no call to prayer. Only her presence, quiet, rooted, as though she herself had grown out of the stone floor. Edric stood beside her, hands ink-stained, sleeves rolled to the elbow. He had not left the chapel in 2 days. I saw them moving the torches, he whispered. At dusk. They'll burn it tonight. Ellen nodded. I know. No one begged. No one planned an escape. Instead, they began to remove what could be saved. Not riches, there were none. Not heirlooms, the chapel held no relics of gold or saints. They saved names. Pages of the book, carefully unbound and rolled. Small bundles of fabric, marked with the sigils of the forgotten. Stones with hand-carved initials gently lifted from the threshold and passed from palm to palm. Children helped. Even the smallest hands were needed, and somehow, those hands carried the most gently of all. When night came, the villagers did not run. They sat in the chapel, pressed shoulder to shoulder, candles flickering against stone, the smell of ink and wax heavy in the air. They had boarded the windows, but left the door open. There would be no hiding, only witness. The flames began at the square's edge. Quiet at first, a shimmer of orange against the dark, then louder. A crack of dry wood, a hiss of snow, turning to steam. The soldiers formed a half circle. Behind them stood Inquisitor Varric, still silent, still watchful. And then he raised a torch. Not to hurl it, but to wait. He called once a single clear command. Surrender the woman and the book. No one moved. He called again. No answer. Then one of the villagers, the baker's wife, her apron still dusted with flour, stepped forward. If you burn it, she said, you'll burn us with it. Varric's eyes narrowed. That is not our intent. But it's the result, Edric called from the doorway. Ellen stepped forward. She held the book to her chest. Do it then, she said, her voice carrying without effort. But know that fire does not destroy memory. It only scatters it. A silence fell. The kind of silence that stretches beyond breath. The kind that feels like it belongs to something older than people. Then the torch fell. The first flame licked across the chapel roof like a tongue testing the edge of a wound. Wood groaned. Smoke billowed. Inside, the heat grew quickly, not enough to drive them out, but enough to remind them that even stone holds breath when threatened. Still, no one moved. They sat. They sang. Not hymns, not chants. Lullabies. River songs. Names turned into melody. One child began humming, and others followed. Before long, it became a low, rising chorus, not mournful, but steady, strong. A song that had no beginning, no end. And as the fire grew above them, something strange happened. The chapel did not collapse. Its roof blackened. The beams cracked, but the walls held. The fire raged and spat, but the stones stayed cold. Outside, Varric watched with narrowed eyes. The flames roared, but the chapel stood. A soldier approached him, uncertain. "We should breach the door?" Varric shook his head. He turned away, and for the first time, he looked not victorious, but confused. By dawn, the fire had exhausted itself. The roof was gone. The altar was scorched, but the people inside remained blackened by smoke. Yes, but alive, breathing, whole. And the book? Still in Ellen's arms. Its pages charred at the edges, but its spine unbroken. That morning, Varric left without a word. The soldiers followed. No declaration. No judgment. No final strike. Only the retreating sound of hooves on thawing ground, and the faint smell of burnt oil lingering like an old grudge. The villagers emerged as the sun crested the hills. Ellen stood in the doorway of what remained, the book cradled like a relic. The walls were blackened, but the threshold was whole, and beside it, someone had placed a new stone. No name, no mark. Just this, carved in rough, unsure hands. We did not burn. The chapel stood in ruins, but it was not silent. Birdsong returned first tentative, as if unsure it was allowed. Then came the sound of sweeping, of water sloshing in buckets, of old hammers pulled from barns and rust scraped off nails. The villagers did not wait for permission. They began to rebuild. Not in defiance, not in anger, in remembrance. Children carried stones. Women mixed mortar with numb fingers. Osric, though he could barely stand without a cane, sat beside the steps and whittled new beams from green wood. The smell of fresh-cut pine mingled with the bitter tang of soot, as if the world had decided to make room for both memory and growth. The chapel's roof would take weeks, but they would build it, together. Ellen stayed mostly silent. She worked, yes, hauling stones, threading rope, copying names from charred pages to new ones. But her voice came less often now, as though something inside her had shifted. Not broken, not dimmed, but transformed. She dreamed of the river every night now, but it no longer called her. It stood beside her. Il n'a camino more in visions. Nor did Mara or Nera or the weeping ones beneath the reeds. They had given what they could. Now it was Ellen's turn. One morning she found a package waiting at the chapel steps, wrapped in oilskin, bound with twine. Inside was a letter, written in a tight, elegant hand. Ellen, they have exiled me, not by name, but by silence. My seat is empty, but no one asks why. Your name is now forbidden within the abbey walls, your village marked unreachable. But I remember, what stood in fire did not fall, and what sang within it did not scream. I will keep a copy of your book, hidden in the dust, beneath the bones of saints who forgot how to listen. If memory is a sin, then may it damn us both. She folded the letter and placed it beneath the new cover of the ledger. It didn't change anything, but somehow it made everything feel different. Even fire had cracks. Even judgment could bleed. By the end of the second week, visitors began to arrive. Not soldiers, travelers, strangers, a woman with her face half covered, who left behind a necklace made of thorns and whispered a name Ellen had never heard. A boy on crutches who knelt before the threshold, touched the stone that read, "We did not burn," and wept without a sound. Some came to pray, some to ask, some simply to see. The village did not turn them away. There was no priest now, only memory. One of the children asked Ellen that week, "Are we a village or a story?" She paused, brushing soot from the spine of the second book. "We were a village," she said. "Then we were a warning. Now we're a beginning." The child didn't fully understand, but she smiled anyway, and Ellen smiled back. That night, Ellen walked to the river for the first time since the fire. Alone. No one followed. The mire water flowed quietly, neither fast nor slow. The ice was gone now, its surface thin and glassy, reflecting stars too dim to name. Reeds swayed gently in the bank's breath, and frogs called from places unseen. She sat at the edge, pulling her cloak tighter, and listened. But the river didn't speak. It simply was, like a heartbeat older than names. And as she watched its current move in endless silence, she realized something. The river had never been judgment. It had been truth. And what drowned within it was not always guilt. Sometimes it was fear. Sometimes it was love. Sometimes it was simply a woman too tired to fight any longer. Ellen reached into her satchel and pulled out the first page of the original book, singed, water-stained, torn at the edge. She placed it on the grass, weighed it down with a river stone, and whispered, "You were the first to be remembered." Then she stood and walked back to the village. The chapel had no bell now. But as Ellen entered through the open doorway, a breeze stirred the hanging cloth above the altar, and it flapped once a hollow, echoing sound. And somehow, that single motion felt louder than any bell had ever been. The final stone was laid at the chapel's base the following week. It was small and dark, worn smooth by river water, uncarved save for one line scratched into it with the tip of a nail. Memory is not mercy. No one knew who placed it there, but no one removed it. Spring arrived not with blossoms, but with breath. The kind of air that no longer bit the skin, that didn't carry smoke or dread, only thaw and wind and the rustling of things once frozen. Children walked barefoot again. Men unclenched their jaws when they spoke. The river, though still cold, no longer seemed like a threat, only a path that wound beyond what could be seen. And in the center of the village, where once stood fear and fire and silence, now rose a structure of timber and stone. The Chapel of the Remembered. It had no steeple, no bell, only a door that never closed, and a roof open to the sky. Inside, there were no pews, only benches low to the ground, and long shelves that held objects wrapped in linen combs, beads, spoons, notes written on scraps of old shirts, each labeled with a name, each with space left beside it for more. In the center stood the book now in its third volume, resting on a wide table carved with hundreds of initials. Children were allowed to trace them. Elders came to sit in silence beside them. Travelers sometimes wept as they added new ones. And Ellen? She did not lead. She listened. The girl Hester's daughter, now 9, sat each morning by the open wall and greeted whoever passed with a smile and a question. "Do you have someone you remember?" It was never said cruelly. It was never said twice, but somehow it was always answered. Father Thorn never returned. Some said he had gone to Denswick and chosen silence. Others believed he had walked into the woods one day and simply kept walking. But once, months later, a box appeared on the chapel threshold. Inside was his rosary split in half and a page from an old sermon book. On the back, written in shaky script, were 7 names, all women, all forgotten. Until then, the Abbey never came again. They stopped sending riders, stopped sending warnings. Whether out of fear or shame or simple exhaustion, no one knew. But stories began to spread of other villages unboarding old cellars, of fields left fallow for years where women once worked being sown again, of quiet rivers where someone had begun to leave stones with names scratched into them. One evening, near the end of summer, Ellen sat at the edge of the village, watching the fireflies dance in the tall grass. The night was warm. A breeze stirred her loose hair. The sky above was filled with stars. Beside her sat Edric, older now, though only a year had passed. He still inked the books, still mended the torn pages, still spoke little, but with more steadiness. "They're asking if you'll speak in Halimere," he said softly. Ellen smiled faintly. "About what?" "About how to remember." She turned toward the horizon. "I don't know if I can teach that. You already have." He paused. "I think they just want to hear the voice of someone who refused to forget." When he left, she remained, staring at the dark edge where trees met sky. The world felt both larger and smaller now, not because it had changed, but because she had. Once, everything had been the river and the chapel and the whispers. Now, it was everything. And yet, still, she thought of the drowned. Still saw them sometimes not in dreams, but in gestures, in wind, in the shiver of leaves before rain. She did not speak to them anymore. She carried them. And that, she had come to understand, was all they ever wanted. Not vengeance, not monuments, only to be carried. As she stood to return, she noticed something in the grass, a small, pale feather caught on a blade of wheat. It trembled in the breeze, then lifted, spun once, and vanished into the dark. She watched it go, then whispered for no one to hear, "I remember." And the wind, soft and warm, answered, "We know." And so the story of the Riverborn comes to a close, not with thunder, not with a final judgment, but with a quiet breath and the weight of remembrance. Ellen did not save her world with swords or fire. She did not shout nor lead with might. She simply refused to forget. And in that simple act of remembering what others tried to bury, she became the voice of those who were silenced for too long. She wasn't perfect. She was tired, scared, unsure, but she kept going. Through the cold, through the silence, through the fire. And that is sometimes the most powerful kind of courage, the courage to stay standing when the world insists you vanish. This story wasn't just about her. It was about all of them, the voices beneath the river, the names scratched into stones, the villagers who chose to listen instead of condemn. It was about what happens when we finally stop whispering and start remembering not just the triumphs, but the pain, the injustice, the quiet lives that deserved more than fear and fire. And maybe, just maybe, it was also about us. Because, in our own way, we all carry rivers inside stories we were told not to speak, emotions we were taught to drown, memories we were asked to forget. But like Ellen, we can choose to listen, to remember. And in doing so, we offer peace not just to others, but to ourselves. Thank you so much for spending this quiet time with me tonight. Whether you came here by chance, or whether you're one of our regular late-night listeners, I'm truly grateful you chose to be here. If you haven't already, feel free to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to those who need them. Now, as you close your eyes, I hope the echoes of this tale settle gently in your chest. May your dreams be calm, may your heart feel light, and may sleep wrap around you like the softest river current, steady and slow. Good night, my friend. Sleep deeply. Sleep peacefully. We remember, and now so do you.